Hello, today's question is about historical fiction books, and I've been asked, could I name 5 of my favourite historical fiction books? And then there was another question asking for what's my favourite historical fiction novel. I'm judging from the questions, people aren't asking me specifically about novels set in the ancient world, so I'll talk a bit about that, but I'll be a little bit cheeky and bend the rules a little bit, because it's very hard to choose 5 things, whether it's films, books, whatever it might be, that you prefer above all else. So I'll mention a few honourable mentions, runners-up in each category, and I'll try and look at some different periods of history where the fiction's been set. So let's start with the ancient world, because obviously that's my main period as a historian. I know about that, and I've written my own novels there as well, the Vindelander series, and there'll be other ones coming through in due course. I think there are 2 that vie for the top spot, and I'll come back to them, and both of them are fairly old now, but they have a marvellous atmosphere to them. There is less literature set in the Greek world than in the Roman, and I confess I haven't read a lot of the fiction about Alexander the Great. I'll get round to it at some point. You have to be very careful when you're writing non-fiction biographies or histories of a period to avoid fiction about that. Either, when you're building up, when you're thinking it through, when you're doing the research, when you're writing on it, in case it influences you, because however good it is, and the author of the novel might well have actually put their finger really on the nub of things, and they might well have got to the essence of a character that you feel is probably right, even if you can't prove it. But you have to prevent yourself from being carried away and writing about Mark Antony as if he's the character from Shakespeare, or as if he's Richard Burton. You can't let your thoughts, your interpretation of the sources be shaped by this preconception that that's what these people were like. So, you've got to be very careful if you write about Brutus to distance yourself from Shakespeare and the noblest Roman of them all, because in many of the sources in Cicero's letters, Brutus comes off as a lot less nice than the idealised portrait of the Stoic philosopher who's desperately trying to do the right thing that Plutarch gives, and that Shakespeare then fleshes out and turns into really the tragic hero of the play Julius Caesar. It's more about Brutus than it is about Caesar. So I've read less. I must confess, I like the feel for Greek society given by Christian Cameron's novels, both the ones set post-Alexander and then the first-person ones about the Persian Wars. The idea of competition, of the importance of sports, the gymnasium, and this sense of pride, respect, the need for Greeks to be first. I think he gave a good flavour for Greek society that I rather liked. But again, I'm working on Greek history at the moment, so I'm definitely not reading anything like that at the moment, because it's the danger of contamination is simply too strong. But those are worth a look, and he's still, I think he's still working on that series. I'm not quite sure. I know he's done some medieval stuff as well, which I've not seen yet. Harry Sidebottom writes marvellous stuff that, if I can find myself a time when I'm not close to either writing an ancient novel of my own, because again, if you're writing a novel, you don't want to be reading other historical novels in case their style starts to influence you too much. You don't want us all to end up writing essentially the same one. So, having done Hill 112, I can read a novel set in the Second World War at the moment, but I wouldn't have done that for a couple of years while I was thinking about it, and certainly when I was writing the book. So Harry's stuff has to fit in with when I'm either looking at a completely different period of Roman history to, most of his stuff is 3rd century AD. There's the Ballista series, and there was the Empire series, Iron and Rust, which I think has only had 3 books, and I was hoping he was going to continue, and maybe will sometime, but again, often the readers are fonder of particular characters like Ballista. So these are books where they're written by, he's a distinguished scholar in his own right of the ancient world, the ancient novel, all this sort of thing. So the level of research, I'm a bad audience for most novels set in the Greco-Roman period, because I know more than your average reader would, because it's been my job to look at this stuff. So little things where I don't buy the interpretation, or they do something I think, oh no, that wouldn't happen. bother me in a way they shouldn't and wouldn't bother anybody else. And that's my problem, not the authors, because the authors aren't writing straightforward history books. They're writing good stories with a strong historical flavour, with a strong historical setting, and the stories work because of the characters and the pace, as a novel should, rather than necessarily the 100% accuracy of the background. And often, the ancient world, we can't get 100% accurate. So with Harry's books, I know that he's coming from a very similar background to my own, so he'll, I can see why he does things the way he does them. Even if sometimes he follows an interpretation that I would sort of say, I'm not sure about that, I don't think I quite buy that, but I know why. So I guess we're on a similar wavelength. We write in a different style, but I've enjoyed all of his books. I haven't read his one that's set in the Alexander period yet. Again, I'll get around to that when I'm not doing anything Greek at the time, but that I suspect will be very good. He's a good storyteller, so you need that as well as the history, but for me, I'm happy with the history because, as I say, while I might not agree with everything, I know why it's there, and I know he has a perfectly reasonable, valid interpretation to do it that way. It's just might not be the one that I share in particular. So his stuff I'd heartily recommend. And obviously, Graves, I, Claudius and Claudius the God are marvellous. There are others out there. I've talked a bit in the Spartacus filming about the Howard Fast novel about Spartacus. There are quite a lot of interesting books in the ancient world, and there are some that I think just came out at the wrong time for me. So I suspect if I'd been the right age, if I hadn't started to read lots of fairly heavy ancient history, when, Conigleden and Simon Scarrow had really sort of kicked off this modern trend and fashion for historical novels set in the Roman period, the ancient world, I suspect I would have lapped them up in the same way I lapped up Bernard Cornwell's Sharp novels that did appear when I was still at school. So it's a lot of these things. There'll be plenty of things out there that other people will enjoy and love and will bring them to a great affection for the Roman period or the ancient world, but they might not click for me now. I'm just in a different place. What I want from a novel like this is different to what the vast majority want, and again, that's my problem, not the authors. Colin McCulloch's books I might talk about in detail another time, because there was a specific section on those. I read a couple of them when I was a student, quite enjoyed them, found them a little bit long and heavy going, but again was getting to the same point that I was studying these periods formally, so at that point you really don't want to be reading novels about them as well, because it's just a bit too much of the same thing, and also that fear of contamination. If the novelist has done their research really well, and a lot of them do, then you start coming across things and thinking, did I read that in an ancient source, or how's that got to my mind? I've mentioned elsewhere Robert Graves, because he did the translation, the Penguin edition of Suetonius' 12 Caesars, as in exactly the same style as I, Claudius and Claudius the God. I've got confused at times. There have been little incidents that I thought I'd read in in Suetonius that actually proved to be pure Graves. So you have to be very, very careful. So they're well worth it. I know loads of people who love them, but again, it was probably a timing thing. If they'd come out 5 years earlier, I probably would have lapped them all up and read them all with great gusto, but I was studying too much for that to be the approach I wanted to take, or the style, and also relaxation. There's an element where you need something different to switch off, so it was easier to read a thriller or a P.G. Wodehouse or something when you're studying Roman history in great detail all the time, and I find that when I'm writing books as well now, that I want to read something light that's unrelated to what I'm doing. So again, I can't quite decide which of these two I should put first, but my choice for my favourite Roman novel, which will be the first of my top 5, I think, I know it's a toss-up between George Shipway, Imperial Governor, which presents itself as an account written by Suetonius Paulinus of Boudicca's rebellion. So he's the Roman governor who is faced by, first of all, he intervenes into what's now Wales, goes to Anglesey, the Isle of Mona, destroys the groves of the Druids there, all this sort of thing, when this huge rebellion erupts behind him. And it's written by someone I I'm pretty sure I read the author had Indian Army experience, because it has that feel. There's clearly an influence of the British Army of the early 20th century in India and elsewhere it's operated, and the ways an imperial government thought about things. So although he's very good in putting this in a Roman context, you can see an element of this sense of a modern imperial power and how it might think about and deal with problems. So there's elements where that might be anachronistic. Some of his reconstructions of how the Roman army works aren't ones that we would follow as a rule now today. But it's interesting. I like it because obviously one of my big interests is the Roman army, and this is a book very much about the Roman army fighting a major war, and a famous war. So it's exciting stuff, it's good stuff, and it was a wonderful story. And I came to this, I remember an uncle of mine found it in a second-hand bookshop, I think it was published in the 60s, and sent this to me, though it was posted with I think there was a stamped address envelope to return it, because he promised to lend it to a friend of his as well. But I read that, loved it, and then later on when it was reissued, I was pleased by my own publisher at the time, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, reissued it when they reissued a lot of older books that I'd never been able to get my hands on before. I've got my copy, but you can get it on Kindle and all this sort of thing now. So it's well worth a read. I think probably it's been edged out of first place by Wallace Bream, The Eagle in the Snow, which is another, again, 50 years old and more. This is it's set at the beginning of the 5th century AD, begins in Britain, goes to the Rhineland, and culminates in the 406, when the river froze, and there's several barbarian groups or groups following various warlords cross the Rhine. It's one of the key stages in the sort of collapse of administration in the Western Empire. And again, it's one of those things where our understanding of the history of that period has changed since then. Particularly our understanding of how the Roman army worked has changed. So you have lots about, I think there's stirrups and stuff come in and all this sort of thing as a new innovation, explaining why they can have good cavalry and all this sort of thing, which we don't really buy anymore, and it doesn't deal with. It was before we understood how the four-horn saddle worked and all this sort of thing. Some of his organisation, a bit like Shipway, there's an element where it's too modern. And again, there's that similar sense. I think Bream also had an Indian army administration connection. In fact, I'm pretty sure he did, given one of his other novels. What it does marvellously is it creates a sense of this system that's no longer really working properly, of a decayed administration where there's never enough resources, and even when you've got something close to it, they can't be employed properly because different branches of government, different elements of society aren't cooperating with the army. So even though this is desperate, and look, all your cities are about to be threatened and probably going to be sacked and burned down by the enemy, you don't actually want to do anything to prevent this until it's too late. And there's a big conflict between the main character, the Roman commander, and a local bishop, who is standing up to him time and time again. And it's played off as a sort of pagan-Christian rivalry between the two. They just don't like each other. But the bishop is actually presented as a decent man who's doing what is clearly the wrong thing time and time again, but he believes to be the right thing for a free, proper Roman and Christian society, and respect for individuals and their rights, even though, and hasn't yet accepted how desperate the situation is. And when he finally does accept it and throws himself into the cause of trying to help the defence, it's far too late. So it's not a cheerful novel, but it, to me, gives a very, very good sense of the Roman Empire crumbling, the administration crumbling. So although there's lots of details you could pick out that don't quite tie in with the evidence, particularly the evidence as we have it and as we understand it now, it's still a marvellous story. So I think that probably goes, just purely as a novel, with good history, decent history, if not perfect history, that's probably got to come first for me. I'd also mention at the same time that this really comes in later, he wrote another book called The Legate's Daughter, that I didn't get on with at all, didn't really take to, which is again Roman. And then, as far as I know, his only other novel was called The Leopard and the Cliff. And it's set in the years just after the First World War, time of the Third Afghan War, and it's about the frontier scouts in the northwest frontier of India, and one of these units that is ordered to retreat, but as really happened at the time, a lot of the soldiers defected, a lot of them joined the cause against the British, and it's about how this unit tries to retreat. And again, it's supposedly from, I think, a Pushton proverb that you're caught between the leopard and the cliff, rock and a hard place, basically. So it's quite grim, and it doesn't have the happiest of endings, though it's interesting as to how and why the man who gets the remnant of the unit back, why he does what he does, and it's very much about his personal honour and this. It's interesting, but it's also about the rivalries, the differences between different groups. It's very vivid. It comes across as real, even to the little details. They've got a Vickers machine gun, or a Maxim. I can't remember which one it is. Might have been that they're the rebels are desperate to get, and they're doing. But whenever this is set up, you talk about the crew. They're filling out their range card. They're doing the sort of little details that. This is how you're taught to do it properly. This is the military way, but generally speaking, a novelist isn't going to mention. So that's again a very powerful book and a good read, and gives you a very vivid sense that seems very real of what it might have been like in that place, in those conditions at that time. So that's the ancient world done. It's harder to think. I mean, while I've read over the years a fair few medieval novels, I'm not sure which ones stick in my mind as well. I mean, I remember the old Conan Doyle, Sir Nigel and the White Company, that again are a very Victorian Edwardian view of the Middle Ages, though with this layer of brutality beneath them, of cruelty. You've got Black Simon of Norwich, isn't it? One of the company, who's a pretty nasty character, but also is one of the lads and is very reliable as a man-at-arms. And you get this sense of atrocities and the cruelty of medieval warfare and the devastation and all this sort of thing. So those stick in my mind. I read the Bernard Cornwell, I can't remember the character's name, but the fellow who's at Cressy and Poitiers, the Agincourt one. I've enjoyed those. I don't think there's a medieval novel that sticks in my mind quite so much. I read The Name of the Rose when I was young, Umberto Eco. I found it rather heavy going, all the stuff about philosophy and Aristotle and this sort of thing, for a fairly disappointing solution to the crime in the end. But again, atmosphere-wise, it was marvellous. There's quite a good, enjoyable Viking romps as well. So I won't go into that too much. I think there's nothing where I say, oh, this is the novel you've really got to read about this period. I've not been able to get very much into the Tudor stuff and the Henry VIII stuff. Just it hasn't clicked for me. So let's see. We better go on. I think we're going to make a big jump through, and we're going to come to the Napoleonic period, because that's important to me. I've written novels about it myself. I suppose here you're dealing with. I've got to mention Sharp's Eagle, because that was the first of the Sharp stories. My brother got it from the W.H. Smiths in town. We were both in school. I remember it had one of those. It was still a sort of slightly 70s, early 80s feel to the cover, where it was quite dramatic. There were paintings before everything started to be sort of photoshopped, modified, tinted photographs, which I don't find anywhere near as exciting. So there's a good dramatic cover. I think the character was obviously Sharp, even had, apart from this he had this sort of billhook thing in one hand, which pretty impressive when you're in your early teens, and there was a suitably busty image of who is the I can't remember who the love interest in the first novel is. No, can't remember off the top of my head. And there are others, perhaps there are others like Sharp's Company in the series that are more dramatic, but I already had some interest from a book on the uniforms at Waterloo in Peninsular War, Waterloo, but I knew about Waterloo a bit. I didn't really know much about the Peninsular War. That kicked me off to going to the library, to finding the memoirs, the Private Wheeler's letters and all this sort of thing, to an interest that is still going very, very strong at the moment, and that has prompted me to write my own novels. So I've enjoyed them whenever a new one comes out, as they do. I don't think the last couple have been his absolute best ones, but they're still really good reads and very enjoyable. I lap them up and will read them almost in a sitting and enjoy them. So I have a great fondness for those. Alan Mallinson's books about Hervey I enjoyed. I think he seems to move more into non-fiction, and I mean, he's probably enjoying a well-earned retirement as well by this point. They were a bit different. They started at Toulouse and then Waterloo, and then went sort of afterwards, and then he only looked back later on. You had flashbacks to the Peninsular War stuff, and about a cavalry regiment. He was going much more for the Patrick O'Brian feel, more flavour, which I think he does. Sometimes makes the character a bit less interesting, and after Hervey's first wife dies, there was something lacking. You feel it's plausible enough that your character would be affected, but he was never quite as likeable a character. He became almost the perfect officer, but he wasn't always so interesting as a human being to be the hero, the main protagonist that you were reading about. So I've enjoyed those, but again, it would be hard to remember one specifically that this is, the great novel that everybody wants to read if you read that period, but they're an enjoyable set. I guess, I read C.S. Forester and lapped up all of those. I think The Happy Return still is my favourite, the first Hornblower. It may be because of the Gregory Peck, Virginia Mayo film that I have great affection for. Those are marvellous. I remember as a student I read lots of Alexander Kent, W. Pope, all this sort of thing. I think, like many people, the Patrick O'Brian, Jack Aubrey and Maturin, those novels, they're very good novels. They have marvellous period atmosphere, and they have good dramatic stories as well that so often are based on real incidents. So I think I'd probably choose HMS Surprise. So I think this is my Napoleonic era novel, and sorry old boy Tolstoy, but perhaps I read War and Peace when I was too young, but at times it's heavy going, it's marvellous in some ways, but I think as a straightforward recommend, I think this is a good novel. If you like novels you'll probably read, go for HMS Surprise. The first couple in the series are a bit slow-paced. HMS Surprise, suddenly it clicked with me, and I don't know whether that was the nature of the novel. I think it is pacier, but also it might be I'm just getting used to the characters. But that's a series where even the ones that are primarily set on shore are interesting stories. And I think I'm one of the many who regrets that the Peter Weir movie never got a sequel. When Russell Crowe told the lesser of two Weevils joke, I warmed to him as Jack Aubrey from that point on, and from then it worked. And the atmosphere of it, the detail is lovely. Moving into the 19th century. Again, I haven't read it for years. I remember Shara, The Killer Angels, as a marvellous novel, and of course it inspired the movie Gettysburg, which is very impressive. I fight a little bit shy of the American Civil War because I feel it's fascinating, and there is so much good material written about it, particularly non-fiction, that it's one of those things, if you develop an interest, you dive into and you're never going to come out, because and you'll be swimming around very happily, but it's just one of those things. So far, I've not bought into it so heavily, even though it's come very close. And I went to speak at the Virginia Military Institute a few years ago, and you go somewhere like that, you are walking in the shadow of history, and you think, oh yeah, this would be interesting, let's find out some more. But so far, good. I think I will go for 19th century novels with George MacDonald Fraser's Flashmans, and while for my money Flashman and the Redskins is probably the best pure novel in the way he weaves these two different stories, because it's in two sections together, and he's one of the 49ers, and you get the sense of he lives amongst the Apaches for a while, and then he ends up at Little Bighorn. That's a marvellous novel, and I love westerns and all this sort of thing, but I think probably my favourite of the series, and my choice, would be Flashman and the Great Game, because 1857 and the rebellion, the Indian Mutiny, then is such a fascinating period. And again, it's close to the Redskins as one of the best just pure novels. It's exciting stuff. You get to Cawnpore, and MacDonald Fraser is very good, and he explains the situation because you have Flashman living, pretending to be an Indian soldier, a Sawa in the light cavalry at one point. So you get the barrack room view of the men who are going to mutiny, and the sense of complication that for many this is something where it all feels beyond their control. And you also get the atrocities on both sides. You get the cruelty, the viciousness, the massacres that occurred. You also get, he runs across a group of volunteer cavalry, a British unit that's composed of officers whose regiments have mutinied, merchants and others whose families have been massacred, and he describes them as sort of drunk with killing. They've got to the point where they're betting on how long it's going to take for someone to die when they've hanged him. He doesn't make it simple that just, oh, goodies and baddies. It is it's a sign of where everyone's gone a bit mad and the whole thing gets out of hand and one atrocity sparks another. So I think it's just very, very good, and it's a good introduction to the genuine history of the period. It's a very good novel. You've got the defenders at Cornwall behind that pathetic barricade somehow holding out, and then the surrender, the massacre, the complication as to just what's going on, who caused that, get to the Bibigar, the massacre there, but you also have the Rani of Jhansi as this very heroic figure that's leading a rebellion. It's unusual to have a woman motivating troops and leading an army so well. And she's depicted in a very favourable way as an extremely strong character who's trying to do the best thing. So I think it's an interesting book. It's a very well written book. It's a very funny book. And you have the grim moments. Flashman wakes up tied to the barrel of a gun, because this was the method of executing a lot of mutineers. Been copied from the Moguls, where you didn't put a shell in the gun, you just put the charge, you tied somebody to the muzzle, let them off, and they were just spread all over the landscape. So it's got those grim moments, and it turns it into sort of black farce as well. So I would go for MacDonald Fraser, Flashman and the Great Game, as another historical novel that sticks in my mind. I think it's one of those ones that I've gone back to and I've read several times. If we come on for the First World War, I'll just mention one because it's also going to be I think it'll come as my favourite of all time. There are obviously lots you've got Sassoon, you've got Graves, you've got powerful novels written by people who were there and about the First World War, Remarque obviously were Quiet on the Western Front as well for a German perspective. Of all of them, the one I'd choose would actually be V.M. Yeats' Winged Victory. And this wasn't published till I think the late 20s, early 30s, written after the war. So there are elements where you can see that post-war influence on the way the characters act and think and talk, some of the views they express, the disillusion of them all, that this has just been a waste. And it's about flying in the First World War, and I have a particular interest in that. I've read lots of memoirs, lots of non-fiction of the pilots of that first air war, because it's the pace of technological change that within less than a decade of Blériot flying across the English Channel, only a few years before that the Wright brothers doing that first flight, you've got two huge formations of fighter planes, of bombers operating over the Western Front. The difference between a 1914 aircraft and a 1918 Fokker D7 or something like that is quite staggering, this progress, and it's all very new, and it's at contrast obviously to the mud and blood of the trenches. Yeats was a Sock with Camel pilot, and it's very much, you can feel his character is based very much on his own logbook, his own experience. It's all about 1918, the last year of the war, and a lot of it is about ground attack, ground strafing as they call it, and just that steady attrition within the small squadron, the group of pilots, as man after man falls. And this is a theme that's come back time and again, but often it's about the dogfights and the sort of Knights of the Air stuff. This is very much an antidote to that, but it also has moments where he captures the beauty, the excitement of flying in those early aircraft, of some of these encounters, of the closeness of friendship. It's not a simple book, and I found it very, very moving, and again, I've gone back to it and read it again. Finally, again, because it's an interest of mine, I've just had Hill 112. Novels about the Second World War, there are obviously lots of them. So many that I'll only be able to mention a few. Obviously, there's Montserrat, the Cruel Sea, C.S. Forester's The Ship, and then The Good Shepherd, which they turned into Tom Hanks-filled Greyhound. Very, very vivid. Plenty of others out there. I think for this, I'll mention, particularly I'm recording this on the weekend of the commemorations of Arnhem. So there's Geoffrey Powell, Men at Arnhem, is extremely good. He also wrote another book that I think was called The Devil's Birthday. I've just read, because I've finally been able to get my hands on a copy, Zeno the Cauldron. So that's been reissued in paperback, and I recommend to anybody. Written by a man who commanded a platoon of the Independent Parachute Company, and it's about it's obviously based quite closely on his own experiences. This platoon, that they're dropped before the main drop to mark the landing zones for the gliders, and they go all the way through to the evacuation. It's very vivid, it's very powerful, it's well with, it is rightly thought of as a classic. And it's, I say, I only just finished that yesterday because I've never been able to get my hands on a copy before. I remember a lad at school had one, but by the time he'd finished it, he'd left and moved on to boarding school, so I didn't get to borrow it. But I remember him praising this highly then. However, I'll put at the top of my list Alexander Barron, From the City, From the Plough, simply because it's helped to inspire things like Hill 112, but to give a sense of what it was like to be in the army and what it was like to be in Normandy. It's a very good book. It's quite short, but it packs a lot in. So I'd put that there. Maybe there are other people, you could easily debate what should be there, and I'm sure I've forgotten lots of others, there, and that's even without going into novels originally written in other languages about other aspects of it, and, Thin Red Line and things like that stand out. As again, it's so obviously written by somebody who was there. So I think those are my choices. There are 5 just about in there, but there are lots of others around them. I'm tempted to put Winged Victory because it's probably the book that I think I'll keep coming back to year after year as my favourite of all time, just because it tells me about something. I've never flown an aircraft. I've obviously been a passenger in one, but I've never flown one. Certainly never flown an open top thing. I wasn't around then, but for a sense of that generation, that experience, those pilots at that time, it comes across as, it struck me as close to being there as you possibly could be. Whether that's true or not, again, I don't know, I wasn't there. But for me, that's important. But again, Eagle in the Snow is up there, the Flashmans are up there, the Patrick O'Briens are up there. I like a lot of historical novels, and it's very hard to choose one above everything else that you like. So more than anything else, in the same way that I couldn't choose one film that above every others, that's the only one I ever want to see again. So that's my take. It's been a rather longer video than I planned, but there is a lot of great stuff out there, and I'm sure I'll kick myself in an hour or so's time because I'll remember there's something that I really should have mentioned. But anyway, that's it for now. So bye. Thanks for watching.